Part 1. The Veil in the Cedar Box. The veil arrived before breakfast, with my name sewn inside it. Not written on a card, not whispered in a corridor, sewn into the bridal lace and thread the color of dried blood, beside a date that should have had nothing to do with me. That was how the third diary I locked beneath the floorboards of Blackwood Manor began. A bridal veil, folded inside a cedar box, wrapped in black ribbon, and delivered on a Friday morning while the house still smelled of rain and coffee and old roses. I knew before I touched it that it had been sent by someone afraid of being watched. No respectable parcel arrives with the address written 3 different ways. Mine said Mrs. Eleanor Vale Blackwood on the top, Eleanor Vale beneath it, and in a smaller hand near the corner, the woman who remembers. Adrian saw that last line before I did. He had been standing by the window, pretending to read the newspaper while doing what husbands in troubled houses often do, listening for danger in the silence. Clara sat at the table with a boiled egg untouched before her and a novel open beside her plate, though she had not turned a page in 10 minutes. The box had no sender's name, only a wax seal pressed with the image of a swan and a tower. Mr. Gray recognized the crest when I sent for him. Hollowmere Hall, he said. A coastal estate, 3 counties north, owned by the Earl of Halewick. The family was older than its roof and poorer than its portraits. That is often the most dangerous kind of nobility. It has too much pride to sell the truth, and too little money to keep it buried properly. Inside the cedar box lay a veil of ivory lace, so delicate it seemed less woven than breathed into being. It smelled faintly of lavender, sea salt, and a closed room. A pearl comb was pinned to the crown. Someone had threaded black silk through the edge. Not enough to mourn openly, only enough to suggest that the bride who wore it had been promised to sorrow before she ever reached the chapel. Clara whispered that it was beautiful, then took the word back with her eyes. Beauty can be cruel when it has survived the person it was made for. I lifted the veil. Something scratched against my glove. Along the inner hem, hidden where no wedding guest would ever see it, a name had been stitched in thread the color of dried blood. Eleanor Vale. Beneath it was a date. All Saints' Eve, 1874. I was alive on that date. I was not a bride. I had never seen Hollowmere Hall, never met the Earl of Halewick, and never lent my name to any woman standing before an altar by the sea. Yet there it was, sewn into a dead woman's veil, as though I had belonged to the secret before I knew it existed. There was one folded card beneath the lace. No greeting, no signature, only a sentence written with a shaking hand. If Lady Margaret wears the veil, the same lie will marry her. Lady Margaret, Mr. Gray told me, was the Earl's only daughter. She was to be married in 3 days. By noon, Adrian had ordered the carriage. By dusk, the veil lay across my lap like a sleeping thing, and Blackwood Manor disappeared behind us in the rain. I told myself I was going because my name had been used without my consent. That was not the whole truth. I went because women do not sew warnings into wedding lace unless every easier way of speaking has been taken from them.
Part 2. Hollowmere by the Sea. Hollowmere Hall stood where the land gave up arguing with the sea. The road narrowed between black cliffs and wind-bent trees until the house appeared through the mist, its windows lit like watchful eyes above a garden stripped by salt. The west tower rose higher than the rest, narrow and pale, with one shutter hanging loose. It moved in the wind like a hand refusing to wave. The Earl of Hailwick received us in the entrance hall, beneath a ceiling painted with swans. Sebastian Hailwick was not an old man, though grief had tried to make one of him. He was perhaps 45, with dark hair silvering at the temples and the careful manners of someone who had spent years apologizing for pain he did not understand. He did not ask why I had come. He looked at the cedar box in Mr. Gray's hands and grew so still that even Adrian noticed. Lady Margaret entered before her father could speak. She was slender, fair, and young enough to believe she had already obeyed too much. Her wedding dress was unfinished at the cuffs. A line of tiny stitches hung loose from one sleeve, like a question. She looked at the box, not with surprise, but recognition. That frightened me more than if she had screamed. The Earl's sister, Lady Octavia Hailwick, arrived moments later. Every family that survives on silence has one member trained to guard the door. Lady Octavia was that door. She wore black silk, jet beads, and an expression polished smooth by disapproval. She welcomed me as one welcomes bad weather, with manners and resentment. The wedding, she explained, would not be delayed. Lady Margaret was to marry Sir Alistair Pembroke, a gentleman of property and impeccable connections. The fact that Sir Alistair was nearly twice the bride's age was presented as though arithmetic were a virtue. I asked about the veil. The air changed. The Earl said it had belonged to Viola March, the woman he was meant to marry 22 years earlier. She had vanished on the morning of their wedding. Her carriage was found near the cliffs. Her trunks remained packed. Her veil was gone. By nightfall, Hollowmere had decided she had either drowned herself or run away, and society, hungry as always for a woman's disgrace, preferred the second version. Lady Octavia corrected him. Miss March had jilted the family. That was the word she used. Jilted. It landed in the hall with the dull weight of something rehearsed. No body had been found. No farewell letter had been proved. No servant had seen her leave. Yet the house had lived 22 years as if shame were evidence. Lady Margaret watched her father while he spoke, and I understood that she had heard this story many times, but never believed it with her whole heart. After tea, a seamstress was brought to finish the bride's cuffs. Her name was Mrs. Thorn. She was thin, grey-haired and stooped, with clever hands and a veil drawn over the left side of her face, as though she had suffered an old burn. She kept her eyes lowered until she saw the cedar box. Then she dropped her needle. It struck the floorboards and rolled toward my shoe. I bent to pick it up. Mrs. Thorne's hand reached mine first. Her fingers trembled against my glove. On her wrist, half hidden beneath her cuff, was a scar shaped like a crescent moon. I had seen that mark before, not in flesh, in thread. It had been embroidered beside my name inside the bridal veil.
Part 3. The Bride Who Left No Footprints. The first rule of a house like Hollowmere is that one must never ask the servants what happened. One must ask what they were told to forget. Mr. Gray began with the steward's ledgers. Adrian began with the locks. Clara, who had insisted on coming despite my objections, began with the bride. That was Clara's gift. People told her the softer truths because they believed softness could not be dangerous. They were often wrong. Lady Margaret confessed nothing, but she showed Clara the room prepared for her marriage. It faced the sea. The bed was covered in white linen. On the dressing table lay orange blossoms, pearl pins, and a prayer book too new to have comforted anyone. In the mirror, Margaret looked less like a bride than a portrait waiting to be hung. Clara found the first clue in the hem of Margaret's wedding dress. A single thread of black silk had been worked into the lining, just as it had been worked into Viola March's veil. The stitch was so small a careless eye would call it shadow. Mrs. Thorn had sewn the dress. When I asked the seamstress about it, she said her eyesight was poor. A strange answer from a woman whose stitches were fine enough to hide a name in lace. That evening, the Earl gave dinner in the long room because Lady Octavia believed normal behavior could make abnormal things disappear. Sir Alistair Pembroke sat beside Margaret and spoke of the estate as though it were already his. He praised the cliffs, the tenant farms, the West Tower, the old chapel, and the library windows. He did not praise the bride. Men who count rooms before vows should never be trusted near women. Lady Octavia smiled at him with the satisfaction of a creditor watching a debt become law. The Earl drank almost nothing and looked often toward the empty chair at the far end of the table. I wondered whether Viola March had sat there once. I wondered whether he had spent 22 years pretending not to see her absence. After dinner, I found the old wedding book in the chapel vestry. It should have recorded the marriage that never happened. Instead, the page for All Saints' Eve, 1874, had been cut out with a knife. Mr. Gray found a second book in the steward's office, a private household register where births, deaths, dismissals, and scandals were written more honestly because no one expected God to read accounts kept in pencil. There, on the same date sewn into the veil, was one line. A female infant removed from West Tower. Mother's name not to be written. Witness, E. Vale. Mr. Gray looked at me over the page. I had never been a witness at Hollowmere, but my mother had been born Eleanor Vale before she married my father. She had died years before I learned to ask what she had done for desperate women in desperate rooms. I closed the book carefully. The name in the veil had not been meant to accuse me. It had been meant to summon my blood. Part 4. The Room Above the Sea. The West Tower had been locked for 22 years, which is to say it had been locked for everyone except the person who needed it open. Locks are less loyal than families. Adrian proved that before midnight. A storm had come in from the coast. The house groaned around us. Lady Octavia had retired. Sir Alistair had been shown to the Blue Chamber. The Earl sat alone in the library with a glass untouched beside him. Clara stayed with Margaret, who had begun to shake whenever the wind struck the windows. Mr. Gray held the lantern while Adrian worked at the tower door. I stood behind them with the veil folded over my arm, its lace lifted in the draught like breath. The door opened on a staircase so narrow the walls brushed my sleeves. At the top was a room with a slanted ceiling, a small iron bed, a cracked washstand, and a window overlooking the sea. The air smelled of dust, salt, and lavender gone bitter with age. On the wall, someone had scratched marks into the plaster. Not days. Names. Viola, Margaret, Eleanor. The last name appeared over and over, written sometimes in a woman's hand, sometimes in strokes so deep they must have been made with a hairpin. I touched one mark and felt the plaster crumble beneath my glove. Beside the bed stood a cradle. It had been covered with a sheet, but the shape beneath it was unmistakable. When Mr. Gray lifted the cloth, Clara made a small sound behind us. She had followed after all. In the cradle lay a rotted blue ribbon, a baby's silver bracelet, and a scrap of christening lace. On the bracelet was engraved one word: Maggie. Not Margaret Halewick, not Lady Margaret. Maggie, a child loved before she was useful to anyone. Adrian found the loose board near the hearth.
Beneath it was a packet wrapped in oilcloth. The letters inside had survived damp by stubbornness alone. They were from Viola March to Sebastian Halewick. She had not run away. She had not jilted him. She had given birth in the tower while the household below prepared for a wedding. She had written that Lady Octavia had threatened to declare the child illegitimate, accuse Viola of madness, and send the infant away unless Viola disappeared before dawn. The final letter was addressed not to the Earl, but to my mother. "Eleanor Vale," it said, "if they silence me, remember the child." My mother had been there. She had helped deliver Margaret, and then she had left Hollowmere with a secret large enough to follow her daughter 22 years later. Footsteps sounded on the stair. Mrs. Thorn stood in the doorway, gray veil over her scarred face, candle in hand. She looked at the cradle, then at the letters, then at Lady Margaret behind us. The sound she made was not a sob. It was the sound of a mother seeing a grave open and finding her child alive. Part 5. Mrs. Thorn removes her veil. There are revelations that explode. Others simply remove a veil. Mrs. Thorn crossed the tower room slowly, as though every step required permission from the past. Lady Margaret did not move. The storm struck the window behind them, and for a moment mother and daughter stood separated by 22 years, a cradle, and a lie no one in that house had been brave enough to bury properly. The seamstress lifted her hands to the gray netting pinned across her face. The left side of her cheek was marked by an old burn, not monstrous, not shameful, only human. Beneath the scar, I could still see the young woman from the portrait hidden in the Earl's library. Viola March, dark-eyed, proud, and alive. Margaret whispered nothing. She only touched her own cheek, as if feeling whether blood could answer what memory had not. Viola did not ask to be forgiven for surviving. That is important. Women are too often expected to apologize for enduring what others arranged. She had lived first in a convent laundry under a false name, then in a widow's sewing room, then finally as Mrs. Thorn, seamstress to the daughter she was forbidden to claim. She had watched Margaret grow through hems and fittings, through dropped pins and measured sleeves, through birthdays marked by gowns she was paid to alter but never allowed to bless. Lady Octavia had told the Earl that Viola had fled with a lover. She had told Viola that the Earl had rejected both mother and child. She had told the household that the baby had been stillborn. No one lie would have held for 22 years, but 3 lies, each told to a different wound, can make a prison stronger than stone. The Earl was summoned to the tower before dawn. He came with his hair uncombed and his face bare of all the discipline that had carried him through dinner. When he saw Viola, he stopped on the threshold, as if the years between them had become a physical wall. He did not rush to her. She did not fall into his arms. Real grief is not theatrical. It is stunned, ashamed, and careful where it places its hands. He looked at Margaret last. That was when he understood. His daughter was not the child of his late countess, as Hollowmere had always claimed. She was the child born in the tower on the morning his first bride vanished. Lady Margaret was Viola's daughter, and his. The household would call it scandal. I called it arithmetic finally corrected. There remained only one problem. In 6 hours, Lady Margaret was expected to walk to the chapel wearing the veil that had once failed to save her mother. Lady Octavia still held the marriage settlement, Sir Alistair still held the Earl's debts, and the law, as men have arranged it, often cares less for truth than for signatures. Part 6. The Marriage Settlement. By morning, Hollowmere Hall was preparing for a wedding and a war. without knowing which one would arrive first. Servants carried flowers through corridors. Cook sent up trays no one ate. Lady Octavia moved from room to room with a ring of keys at her waist and victory already arranged on her face. Sir Alistair inspected his gloves in the hall mirror and asked twice whether the Earl had signed the revised settlement. That settlement was the hinge upon which everything turned. Mr. Grey read it in the library, while rain lashed the windows. It placed Lady Margaret's dowry, her future income, and certain coastal lands under Sir Alistair's management immediately upon marriage. If the Earl died without a male heir, Sir Alistair would gain effective control of Hollowmere through his wife. It was not a marriage contract. It was a quiet annexation. The Earl had agreed because he believed the estate had no other hope. Lady Octavia had urged the match because Sir Alistair had promised to settle the family debts. Margaret had accepted because obedient daughters are taught that saving a house is nobler than saving themselves. Viola listened from behind the library screen. She had chosen not to reveal herself publicly until proof could stand beside her. I respected that. A woman wronged by a powerful family is rarely believed because she speaks. She must arrive accompanied by paper, witnesses, and the exhaustion of men who can no longer deny arithmetic. The missing chapel page was our first proof. The tower letters were our second. The christening bracelet was our third. But the strongest proof lay in the veil. Mrs. Thorn had sewn my mother's name into it years earlier, not on the day she vanished, but after she returned to Hollowmere in disguise. She had hoped that one day the lace would find me. My mother had been the only honest witness in the tower. Her name was the one thread Lady Octavia had failed to cut. Clara found the final evidence. It was in Margaret's prayer book, the new one placed on her dressing table. A page near the back had been slit open. Inside was a promissory note, signed by Sir Alistair and Lady Octavia. It promised her a payment from the first transfer of Margaret's dowry. The aunt was not preserving the family. She was selling the bride. When Lady Octavia discovered the prayer book missing, she came to my room without knocking. That told me more than any confession could have done. She saw the cedar box on my bed. She saw the veil. For the first time since I arrived, she looked afraid. Not of God, not of scandal, of a woman with proof. Part 7. The Bride Refuses. The chapel at Hollowmere was built from pale stone and bad conscience. By 11 o'clock, every pew was filled. Guests whispered beneath feathered hats. The sea could be heard beyond the stained glass, striking the cliffs with a rhythm older than inheritance. White flowers covered the altar rail. Black silk had been wound through them so subtly that most people would think it decoration. Lady Octavia had chosen the flowers. Of course she had. Margaret stood in the vestry, wearing the dress Mrs. Thorn had made for her. The black thread hidden in the lining had been cut out before dawn. The veil lay across a chair. It looked innocent there, as dangerous things often do when they are still. I asked Margaret whether she wished to marry Sir Alistair. She did not answer at once. All her life, answers had been prepared for her before questions reached the room. At last, she took the veil in both hands and folded it once, then again. She did not put it on. That was the first vow spoken that day, though no one in the chapel heard it. The organ began. Lady Octavia entered first, upright as judgment. Sir Alistair waited at the altar, smooth-faced and impatient. The Earl stood near the front with the expression of a man who had slept 1 hour and aged 20 years inside it. Mr. Grey sat behind him with the household register beneath his coat. Adrian stood at the rear door. Clara remained with Margaret until the last possible moment. When the bride appeared, the chapel changed. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, because she came bareheaded. No veil, no obedient fog of lace between her face and the world. A murmur moved through the guests. Lady Octavia turned so sharply, the jet beads at her throat clicked like teeth. Sir Alistair stepped forward. Margaret stopped before the altar. She did not accuse. She did not plead. She placed the folded veil on the altar rail, as if presenting evidence to God. Then Viola March entered through the side door. She wore no disguise. Her scar was visible. Her grey hair was pinned simply. In her hands, she carried the letters from the tower and the christening bracelet marked Maggie. I watched the Earl look from the living woman to the daughter he had almost signed away. Some truths do not need shouting. They only need witnesses. Mr. Grey rose. He read the line from the private register. A female infant removed from West Tower. Mother's name not to be written. Witness, E. Vale. Then he placed my mother's old signature beside it, taken from a letter she had written before her death. The handwriting matched. Lady Octavia's composure cracked. Not loudly, not enough for strangers to understand, but enough for her brother to see the shape of every year she had stolen.
Part 8. What the Sea Gives Back. Sir Alistair was the first to recover. Men who marry for property are often quicker than men who marry for love. He declared the scene indecent, the woman an impostor, the letters sentimental rubbish, the bracelet meaningless, the register unreliable, and Lady Margaret overwrought. It was a useful speech. It showed every guest precisely why she should not marry him. Margaret removed her engagement ring and laid it beside the veil. The small sound of gold against stone reached farther than any scream. Lady Octavia tried to leave then. Adrian closed the chapel door before she reached it. He did not touch her. He merely stood where escape wished to be. Mr. Grey produced the promissory note from the prayer book. That was when Sir Alistair stopped speaking. Debt can survive rumors. It cannot survive documentation. The Earl dismissed the guests before scandal could become entertainment. Some left reluctantly. Society hates being denied a public ruin. The family, the solicitor, Mr. Grey, Adrian, Clara, Viola, Margaret, and I remained in the chapel while rain began again against the glass. Lady Octavia confessed nothing fully. People like her rarely do. They rearrange guilt into necessity and call it sacrifice. She had protected the family name. She had protected the estate. She had protected her brother from a woman unsuitable in birth and inconvenient in childbirth. She had protected Margaret from shame by giving her a better mother on paper than the one bleeding in the tower. So many protections. All of them cages. The Earl asked only one question. Where had she sent Viola after the birth? Lady Octavia looked at the folded veil and gave the smallest answer. North. To a convent laundry that took women no one wanted, named. Viola closed her eyes. For 22 years, she had believed Sebastian had chosen silence. For 22 years, he had believed she had chosen flight. Between them stood a sister, a signature, and a house full of people rewarded for not remembering. No embrace could repair that in one afternoon. But when Margaret reached for Viola's hand, The older woman did not hesitate. That was where the story truly changed. Not when the villain was exposed, not when the marriage was stopped. When the daughter chose the mother history had tried to remove. By evening, the sea calmed. The tide pulled back from the black rocks below the tower, leaving things in the sand. Shells, weed, broken glass, and one pearl from the veil comb, loosened at last from its place. Clara found it while walking with Margaret. She brought it to me in her palm. "The sea," she said, "sometimes gives back what houses keep."
Part 9. The Mother's Room. The next morning, Hollowmere Hall opened the West Tower, not for guests, not for gossip, for air. Servants carried out the rusted bedstead, the cracked basin, the torn sheet from the cradle. No one laughed, no one whispered where I could hear. Mrs. Thorn, who was Viola again, stood in the doorway and watched the room that had once been her prison become only a room. That is not a small thing. Places hold power while we are forbidden to name what happened inside them. The moment we name them, they begin to shrink. Lady Octavia left before noon in a closed carriage with 2 trunks, no maid, and the face of someone who had mistaken control for love so long that she no longer recognized either. Sir Alistair departed separately, carrying his hat as if it had betrayed him. Mr. Gray sent copies of the promissory note to the proper offices. He enjoyed that more than he admitted. The Earl asked Viola to remain at Hollowmere. She did not answer quickly. I liked her for that. A woman is not restored to herself merely because the man who lost her finally understands the map. She asked first for a room of her own, not the tower, not the seamstress chamber near the servants' stair, a room facing the garden, with a writing desk, a lock that opened from the inside, and no one permitted to enter without knocking. The Earl agreed before she finished. Margaret did not marry that week. Instead, she walked with Viola through the gallery and stopped before the portrait that had been turned toward the wall for 22 years. It showed a young bride in ivory, dark hair crowned with pearls, one hand resting on a veil she would never wear. Margaret touched the frame, then touched Viola's wrist where the crescent scar remained. Blood is not always louder than kindness, but blood, when hidden by cruelty, deserves the chance to speak. Before I left, Viola gave me the veil. She said it belonged with the woman whose mother had once tried to save her. I told her my mother had failed. Viola corrected me with a calmness that stayed with me long after Hollowmere vanished behind the cliffs. My mother had not failed. She had left a name where a daughter could find it. Sometimes, survival is not rescue. Sometimes it is a thread sewn so carefully into the hem of a ruined thing that time itself cannot pull it loose. I packed the veil in the cedar box. Margaret placed the pearl beside it. The Earl added the bracelet marked Maggie, though Viola insisted it remain with her daughter. Margaret smiled and said, "Daughters may lend proof back to history when history has behaved badly." For the first time since we arrived, Hollowmere sounded almost like a home. Part 10. The Name in the Hem. We returned to Blackwood Manor under a sky washed clean by storm. Adrian said little on the journey. He watched the road, then the veil, then me, as if understanding that every case I accepted pulled one more thread from my own past. Clara slept with her head against the carriage cushion, and the pearl from Hollowmere wrapped in her handkerchief. Mr. Gray rode behind us with the household register in his case, and the satisfaction of a man who had made a villain sign her own undoing. I did not sleep. I kept seeing the name in the hem. Eleanor Vale.
my mother's name before it was mine, my summons before it was my inheritance. At Blackwood, Mrs. Valine took the cedar box from me and grew pale when she saw the swan and tower seal. She crossed herself before remembering she disapproved of superstition. When I asked whether she had heard of Hollowmere, she said only that my mother had once gone north for 3 weeks and returned with her shoes ruined by salt. Then she refused to say more until tea. That is how I learned there was more. There is always more. That night, I opened my mother's old trunk for the first time since childhood. It smelled of camphor, pressed linen, and the grief adults fold away when they think children will not notice. Beneath shawls and letters lay a small packet tied with blue thread. Inside was a scrap of ivory lace cut from the same veil. On it, in my mother's hand, were 3 words: "Not the end." I sat for a long time with the scrap in my palm while rain began softly against the window. Across the room, Adrian stood near the fire and did not ask whether I was afraid. Clara, woken by the storm, came to the doorway and stopped when she saw my face. The truth about Hollowmere had been restored. Viola had her name. Margaret had her mother. The Earl had the burden of living honestly with what he had failed to see. And I had one more piece of my mother's life, which is to say, one more locked door inside my own. I placed the veil in my diary chest beside Marian's black brooch and the dried white rose from Ravenscourt. 3 women, 3 houses, 3 secrets that had survived because someone, somewhere, refused to let silence have the final word. Before I closed the chest, I touched the stitched name one last time. Eleanor Vale. For years, I had believed a name was something one carried. Now I knew it could also be something left behind for another woman to find when the world was finally ready to listen. That is why I locked the 3rd diary beneath the floorboards. Not because the story was finished, because the veil had taught me that some warnings are not written for the living alone. Some are sewn for daughters not yet born.